I'm just going to move this a little bit closer, because one bit of feedback I always get is that I have a quiet voice. So slides should be coming up behind me. Here we go. Oh.
See one up the screen, Jon.
Yeah. Oh, good. Right. Right. I've been at Park Church for around about 18 months and love being in that church. Before that, I was in another church for 23 years, and the reasons we moved on are complicated, as they often are in these situations. But I was part of the preaching team in that church. In fact, it was a group of 3 churches, and one of the churches had a view very similar to the view that you have, looking out. So that church was on Alsager's Bank, which is nowhere near Alsager. For those of you who don't know, Alsager's Bank is near Halmer End. That may or may not help you to locate it. But the beautiful view across there on a clear day is very, very similar. But when we moved churches, I sort of felt and feared, it was one of my regrets, that my preaching days might be over. So it was a big surprise, and I was really pleased to be asked to come here. And it's a bit of a test case. We'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll be just a one-off, but maybe I will be returning to preaching a bit more. So, be devoted to one another. Facebook is great for finding out all sorts of things about the lives of my friends and family. I get to find out about their political views, what they're eating, where they like to go on holiday, how they spend their time, what they feel about theological matters, their family lives, their hopes and fears. It's enabled me to know far more about my church family than I would ever know from 5-minute conversations at the end of a church service. The downside of all this is it highlights some challenging differences between us. Shock horror, I've discovered that not everybody holds the same political views as me. Not everybody likes the same food. Not everybody agrees with me on every theological matter. Some people are much more positive than I am. Some people are a lot more negative. Some like sport, and some don't. I don't. It was a little bit like this for the early church in Rome when Paul wrote this letter that we've had the reading from today. He was trying to help this new church in Rome find ways to live together, to work together for the sake of the gospel. Being a mix of Jews and non-Jews from a range of very different backgrounds and cultures, they had lots of differences to overcome. Ultimately, it was only their unity in Christ and their devotion to him that could enable them to live and work together despite those differences. And I had the thought coming up here, maybe a little bit like the Primitive and the Wesleyan Methodists. Some of you will know far more about that than I do, living in Malcop, but so there are a lot of one another's. So we're talking about being devoted to one another today, but I just thought I'd have a quick gallop through some of the other one another's we get in the New Testament. In John 13, Jesus told his disciples to love one another, because by this, everyone would know that we are his disciples. The mark of being a disciple of Jesus is that we should love one another as Jesus himself loves us. Jesus died for us, so that is how much we should love one another. When you think about it, this means that no cost, no inconvenience, no sacrifice should hold us back from loving one another. But loving one another isn't just a feeling with no associated action. Loving one another is a force that drives us to act. For Jesus, that love drove him to the act of giving up his life for us. And he's our ultimate example of how we should be with each other. Loving one another might actually cost us something. It might cost us a lot. It might even cost us everything. In 1 Peter 4, Peter tells the church to offer hospitality to one another. We're going to touch on hospitality a bit today, and I was pleased to hear that you're going to pick up that theme in your Bible study this week. So that's an interesting connection. Peter tells the church to offer hospitality to one another. That's sharing meals together, offering material and practical support, offering a place to rest and relax together, a bed for the night maybe. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul tells the church to be kind to one another. There's that word kindness again. Tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Colossians chapter 3, Paul tells the church to teach and admonish one another. In the context of family life, Paul tells the Ephesians in chapter 5 to submit to one another. And in Philippians chapter 2, Paul talks about how the relationships that brothers and sisters in the church have with one another should be based on the mindset of Christ. I'm sure there are loads of other one another's in the Bible, but today we're just going to be looking at being devoted to one another. And in this short passage, Romans 12, 9 to 13, we can see some really practical ways of being devoted to one another in the church family. We're going to look at what being devoted to one another should look like in the church. So let's plunge in. Don't be too dismayed when I tell you that this is a 6-point sermon. Some of the points will be very brief. But beware, after my 6th point, I won't be quite finished because I'm going to end by sharing something quite personal just to illustrate some of the points that I've been making. So firstly, being devoted to one another means speaking honestly about the good, the bad, and the ugly we see in one another. I noticed that in the reading, I prepared this sermon from the NIV version, but this church you seem to use the English Standard Version, which uses the word genuine. So love must be genuine. So speaking honestly about the good, the bad, and the ugly that we see in each other. And when I say ugly, I don't mean that you should all feel free to point out that I have a big nose and a receding hairline. We're talking about character and attitude here. Verse 9 says, love must be sincere or genuine. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. These two sentences come together for a reason. The second part of the verse tells us how we should approach the first part of the verse. So sincere love doesn't allow us to simply ignore the evil in those around us. Now, some of us are quite good at pointing out the shortcomings of other people. But most of us are probably a bit more inclined to avoid the awkwardness of being directly critical or negative towards people. We just try and keep everything nice and friendly, even if it isn't entirely sincere or genuine. But hating what is evil isn't simply giving us license to be critical and judgment about one another's failings. Actually, it's a big responsibility and a supportive role that has to be earned in any relationship. If we're to frankly and safely discuss concerns that we might have about one another, we need to be in relationships of trust and warmth. In our church family, we're not going to be equally close and open with absolutely everyone. It would get really tiresome if at the end of every Sunday service, the entire church was queuing up to point out all my failings. So in reality, it's going to be just a few people in a closer circle. The point is that there should be someone, perhaps a few people in our church family, who can gently, lovingly help us to see our weaknesses, those areas that we need to work on, that we struggle with. And we should be willing to be that person for at least a few other people. But we're also expected to celebrate the good we see in others. Hating the evil that we see in our brothers and sisters must be balanced by a celebration of all that is good in them. This involves the deliberate practice of properly considering the good we see in our church family. And there's lots of good to be found. So, as a brief exercise, just think about the person sitting in the seat in front of you. If you're on the front row, think about the person sitting behind you. And if you don't know them, make it your goal to find out something good about them. So just for a moment, see if you can identify one good thing about the person sitting in front of you or behind you. Okay, you can stop that. We'll carry on. Next point. Secondly, being devoted to one another should look like a loving family. Verse 10 of the reading is where the title of today's sermon comes from. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. The latest version of the New International Version says, be devoted to one another in love. So it's dropped out the word brotherly. But this actually hides the fact that the term love does indeed include the idea of brotherly love. So the New Testament word used here is Philadelphia. And this term was allowed round long before the American city of that name. Lots of other versions, including the English Standard Version and the King James Version, include the word brotherly. So it looks as if our trusty NIV has perhaps lost something important. For me, the term brotherly love seems important because it introduces the idea of family. And obviously, it's not just brothers who need to be devoted to one another, but all of us, men and women. Including the word brotherly tells us that it's all about family connection, the sort of love that we find among brothers and sisters in a family. It's about the Church of God being a family. Not just the love and devotion of a friend or a colleague, as lovely as those might be, but the close love and devotion we should see in families. You've probably heard it said before that church should be like a big family. So here's a big church family having family time together. But family should be like small church. I actually got these images by AI. I asked AI to create 2 images of big church family, small church family, and this is what it came up with. So, yeah. Church should be like big family, and family should be like small church. And perhaps we should even take out the word like and just say that church should be big family, or even church is big family. Just for a moment, we do need to reflect that there is a sad reality that sometimes our families are far from perfect. Some families, many families are broken, places of violence and abuse, coldness, neglect. So my saying that church should be like family might make some people want to run screaming from the place never to return. So when we say that church should be like family, we should say that we're talking about an ideal, God's perfect design for family that's really worth aiming for. This is based around the close and unbreakable unity that we see in God himself, in the 3 persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, relating to and complementing each other perfectly. It's also the perfection of the first family, a married couple in the Garden of Eden, before their rebellion and sin spoilt it forever. So think about all that family should be, all that you would love it to be. And think about how that might play out in church life. Think about how our church relationships should be so much more than the relationships we have with our colleagues at work, our sports teams, our social clubs. So here are 2 challenging questions. What aspects of family life could we see played out in church life? As a church, do we laugh together, eat together, suffering and weeping together, supporting each other when we're under attack, celebrating our achievements and successes together? You probably already do some of this as a church. Can you do more of it? Can you do it better? Asking that question in my own church would be very different. I'd already have some ideas about the strengths and weaknesses. But as a visiting speaker, I know nothing about you as a church. Well, I know a bit more than I did half an hour ago, but I can honestly ask that question without having preconceived ideas about what the answer might be. So what aspects of family life could be played out in your church life? And secondly, what aspects of church life could we see played out in your family life at home? Would it be good to pray together as a family, as you do with your brothers and sisters in church? Would it be good to celebrate and share the wondrous story of God's love for us as we sit around the family meal table? Would it be good to sing hymns together? Steady on, let's not get too carried away. But yeah, I do acknowledge the painful reality that this may be far from possible or likely in some of your families where you might be the only believer. And for you, your church family becomes all the more important. But if your family are Christians, then why not carry some church stuff over into family life? The opposite of bringing family stuff into church life. Thirdly, being devoted to one another means that we put others first. So the second part of verse 10 says, "Honour one another above yourselves." So here's a definition of a totally stuck situation. It's two Christians in a doorway, each saying, "You first, no, you first, no, you first," because they're so desperate to put others first, and nobody gets to go through the doorway. But here's another example for church. If I'm to honour you above myself, should I say that my preference for peace and quiet and contemplation in church services is more important than your preference for a more boisterous and extrovert expression of worship? Or do we honour each other's needs and desires and work on and accept a generous compromise? We might say the same if we differ about how warm to set the central heating, about what colour we paint the walls. You don't paint your walls at all here. About the times of our services and meetings. A whole host of areas where we might differ, some of them trivial, some of them important. Even where we differ over issues in the Bible that we might consider secondary. Do we honour others above ourselves in those kind of areas? Fourthly, being devoted to one another means that we put strenuous effort into serving. Verse 11 says, "Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervour serving the Lord." This is the opposite of being half-hearted and reluctant in stepping up to help. Whether this is to join the welcome team, the catering team, the tech support team, or any other area of church life that we all benefit from. I should be willing to put my needs and wishes aside, as serving God involves serving you. Even to the extent of dying for you, as Christians in some parts of the world do, even today. This whole idea is very countercultural. In the secular world around us, we're told to pursue what we want, what makes me happy, what gives me pleasure. And if I don't want to do something, then I should feel free to simply choose not to do it. There's no place for duty or service or sacrificial giving in that kind of a world. Even the word zeal has a slightly negative flavour to it today, in today's language. So to call someone a zealot, it seemed to be some sort of a mild insult. But in the service of God, Paul is telling us that we should indeed be zealots. It's impossible to be over-enthusiastic as we think about how much we should serve God. Think about characters in the Old Testament who started out very half-hearted, even unwilling to step up and serve God. So Moses asked God, "Isn't there someone else that you can choose to lead the people out of Egypt?" And Jonah, he got on a boat and travelled in the opposite direction of where God wanted him to serve in Nineveh. And look what happened to him. But although both Moses and Jonah started out very much lacking in zeal for serving God and were far from perfect when they did eventually step up, God still used them to do great things for him. And their zeal for serving God and their love towards the people he asked them to serve developed and grew. So the more they did it, the more they wanted to do it. So let's make this very practical. Think about the person doing the tech support for your services, sitting in the corner over there. Sorry to put you on the spot. Being on duty for this kind of task means not being able to entirely relax and freely participate in the worship. If the person clicking the slides on in the songs is so caught up in their own worship time, they might forget to press the slide to move on to the next verse. So they have to be concentrating. They set aside their own needs and give something sacrificially to this time we're enjoying together. In that sense, doing this work involves sacrifice. The same goes for musicians, people who arrive to set the chairs out, to make the coffee, Sunday school. Is it always the same person doing this job in church, or is there a team so that the burden can be shared? I realise this may be a challenge in a small church, and these are only examples. But if there really is only one person able to do this job in services, if there really is only one person able to lead the music, only one person able to sort out the after-service coffee, then make sure you acknowledge that these people are serving God in this. Make a point of thanking them, but also consider if you could join the rota to help out. Can your pastor ever come to a service and simply enjoy being part of the congregation without having a responsibility for some aspect of the service, leading or preaching or praying, etc.? Fifthly, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. This is verse 12. Being devoted to one another involves sharing our joys and struggles in prayerful support. Again, remember the context. We're thinking about how to be with one another. We're in this together. Just a few verses further on in this passage, which we didn't read this morning, Paul tells us that we should rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Being patient in affliction isn't the same as denial or a pretense that everything's okay when it isn't. But I do need to exercise patience as I wrestle with hardship. Some of us are naturally positive and optimistic. The glass is half full. Others, like me, can be a bit glass is half empty. And so we need to make this a deliberate practice, something we pursue and work on to be joyful in hope. And I need to be patient with my brothers and sisters in the church who I see wrestling with hardship. What better way of doing this than being faithful in prayer for one another? This is something I've noticed. It may or may not be true for this church, but I'll see how it goes. One thing I've seen generally in churches is that we're often very good at sharing and praying for one another's physical health needs. Doug has a bad back, Chris is going through chemotherapy, Hilary is having a hip replacement surgery, that sort of thing. And I should say that any similarity to actual people here today is purely coincidental. I just plucked those names out of the air. It's absolutely wonderful and absolutely right and proper that we should be concerned about and pray for each other's physical health needs. But do we talk so easily about our mental health needs, our hopes and fears, our spiritual condition, our doubts, our secret sins, our anger, our disappointments? I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. My sixth and final point is that being devoted to one another means that we generously share our resources. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. These are two really practical ways in which we can be devoted to one another. Sharing with those in need and practicing hospitality are practical actions that should flow naturally from loving one another and being devoted to one another. Actions speak louder than words. Jesus didn't just say that he loved us, he proved it with his actions. And we can only share with God's people who are in need if we are in the sort of church family where those needs can be properly known and shared. And we can only practice hospitality if we're prepared to give up some of our independence and privacy. To open our homes to our brothers and sisters in the church means that we also give something of our time, and they get to see something of our private lives. And think about this, the word hospitality includes the word hospital. And hospitals are places we go to get better, at least in theory. So when we offer hospitality to people, they should be better because of it. When they leave our homes after we've been hospitable, they should feel good because of the hospitality that they've enjoyed. So that's my 6 points, but as promised, I'm going to take a risk here and share a personal example, which I hope will be helpful and connect with some of the ideas that we've covered. So early in 2020, in lockdown, I developed some heart problems. I couldn't walk more than 100 yards without experiencing terrible angina, chest pain. It stopped me in my tracks and took my breath away. So in the middle of lockdown, we were all enjoying our allowed walks, and I wasn't enjoying it. I just couldn't do it. So round about September 2020, I had a surgical procedure that put a rigid cobalt chrome tube into my heart, more commonly known as a stent, into one of the major arteries in my heart. This means that I can now walk for 10 miles without any chest pain, so it worked. Of course, my knees aren't quite so good, but that's another story. My brothers and sisters in church at the time were genuinely concerned about this, and I was really grateful for their support, their concern, their prayer on the matter, even though most of the interactions at the time were via Zoom, which I never really liked. But why was it that there were very few people in the church who knew that in addition to having a physical heart condition, I also struggle with feeling disheartened, downhearted, faint-hearted, half-hearted, even hard-hearted at times? In sharing this, I'm just suggesting that our being devoted to one another in our church family should be deeper and broader than just a concern for our physical health, as important and valid as that is. I'm also suggesting that this has to involve elements of risk, trust, honesty, giving up some of our privacy. It means that we must trust one another with the things that we might naturally prefer to keep to ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugly. If we're to be faithful in prayer for each other, then we need to be open about what our actual prayer needs might be. And perhaps this should extend beyond our physical concerns, as important and significant as those might be. So when you ask me how I am, I might respond with, okay, thanks. The angina pain is much better. But I might also say, my overwhelming feeling of anxiety and pessimism was really helped by your kind words last week, or by last week's sermon. I might also answer that I happen to be feeling particularly miserable this week. And then you will have the challenge of being patient with my affliction and being faithful in prayer for that. I do need to qualify a little bit. I'm not saying that our meetings, our conversations, our interactions with each other should be full of earnest, poor me, oversharing, navel-gazing. Our small groups shouldn't become therapy groups. Remember, we're talking about the church family being a family, not a therapy group. So I'm suggesting that our awareness of one another's needs and our concern for one another should demonstrate a family-like devotion. And I just need to add another quick side note about privacy and confidentiality. Don't assume that if someone shares something personal and sensitive about themselves, that they're necessarily giving you permission to share it with the whole church. We can't make idle gossip or breaches in confidentiality okay by simply adding the words, "I'm only telling you this for prayer." We should be zealous in serving God, and one way of doing this is by serving each other in a whole variety of ways. And thinking about hospitality, this place, this group of big-hearted, open-hearted, kind-hearted people, this gathering of devoted brothers and sisters, should be a hospital for the disheartened, the broken-hearted, the downhearted, the faint-hearted, and the half-hearted. So to finish, you should have been seeing that throughout my personal example. I tried to find an AI-generated vision of somebody struggling to walk uphill. I ended up with a picture of myself in the Isle of Skye. So to finish, in summary, being devoted to one another means speaking honestly about the good, the bad, and the ugly we see in each other. It should look like a loving family. It means that we put others first. It means that we put strenuous effort into serving. It involves sharing our joys and struggles in prayerful support. And it means that we generously share our resources. We love each other because God first loved us. We are devoted to one another because God is devoted to us. Being devoted in our church family means a bond of commitment that causes us to go out of our way for each other. We support each other. We take an interest in the details of each other's lives, not because we're nosy or curious, but because we really do care. This is risky, but so many good things in life entail an element of risk. I think this is a risk that's worth taking. Going back to where we started with my discovering things about you on Facebook that I might not like, the bottom line is that God doesn't expect me to love you or to be devoted to you because I agree with you on every matter, or because I like everything you say and do, or because you are the same as me. He expects me to love you, my church family, and to be devoted to you because he loves you, and he is devoted to you. By showing this sort of devotion to each other, we will be honouring him and promoting the name of Christ with those who look in from outside the church. And lastly, you may not call yourself a Christian this morning, but the appeal of a church family that is devoted to one another in the ways that we've described this morning is just a tiny glimpse of a God who is so devoted to the human race that he's done all of the things that we've mentioned before this morning. And more than that, he sent his son Jesus to be a devoted servant who put others so far above himself that he went to the cross. It cost Jesus everything to bridge the gap between humankind and his Father. But God hasn't made it difficult for you to join this family. You only need to approach him, humbly asking him to accept him as you are, and he will welcome you with open arms. Let's just pray. Father God, we thank you that